Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership webinar relating to the learning from our local Bristol Rapid Reviews. The webinar today will take the form of a presentation and then we will conduct a question and answer session afterwards where we will pause the recording of the presentation. If you have any questions that you'd want to have responses to at the end with the Q&A session, if you can pop them into the chat as we go along and we will come back to them at the end. The presentation element of the webinar, as I've mentioned, is being recorded today. It will be hosted publicly on the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership website, and that's just to make sure that every colleague has that accessibility to the webinar and the learning that colleagues are due to share today. Please can we ask that cameras remain off during the session and that colleagues keep themselves on mute just during the presentation element to try and prevent that disruption to the presentation given today by colleagues. The webinar is being facilitated today by two of our Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership members. So could I kindly come over to Becky firstly to introduce yourself, please, and your role within the partnership?
Hi everyone, I'm Becky Lewis. I'm the chair of the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership's Child Safeguarding Practice Review subgroup, and in my day job I'm the Safeguarding Quality Assurance Service Manager for Bristol City Council Children and Family Services. It's just really brilliant to see you all here today on a Friday and an opportunity for us to sort of think about the wider learning from our serious incident process. So welcome.
Thanks very much, Becky. And can I ask the other colleague, Lorena, to introduce yourself, please, and your role within the partnership?
Hi everyone, I'm Lorena Evans. I'm the Statutory Review Officer for the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership. So I coordinate all of our statutory reviews, including domestic homicide reviews, safeguarding adult reviews, and child safeguarding practice reviews.
Thanks, Lorena. Could I ask you to move on to the next slide for me, please, Lorena? Thank you. So before we move on to any content for today's webinar, we always start with a kind of safety agreement just to remind people around impact and self-care. So when we start to discuss harm or abuse that occurs with children or happens to children, we know that this can have an impact on colleagues. It could be triggering, it could be distressing at any point, regardless of the role or how long we've been in our roles in the safeguarding system. So I want people to think about considering a safe physical and psychological space that they may be able to step away from the webinar to kind of decompress and come back if you feel that you're able to come back to join us. Just to say the expectation, no one is expected to stay at the expense of their well-being during the webinar, so if you need to leave and exit the Zoom room, please do so. And just a reminder around self-care, so it's important that we consider our self-care and maintain that. So please consider the support routes that are available to you, whether that's informal support routes or formal support routes during the webinar and also after the webinar finishes. It's really important. Can I ask you to move on to the next slide for me, please, Lorena? Thank you. So just to kind of open with some expectations of what you can expect from the webinar today. So we're going to open with Lorena explaining the statutory review process. So what does that look like with regards to our rapid reviews and our child safeguarding practice reviews? We're then going to move on to an overview of the national statutory reviews, so those conducted by the national panel between the period of March 2021 to present day. We're going to look at the local reviews, so those Bristol rapid reviews and the learning from those, and that's for the time period of March 2021 to December 2022. And we're also going to think on how are we going to look at improving, so those lessons learned, how are Bristol seeking to implement those lessons learned into practice across the city. So I will ask Lorena to move on to the next slide and hand over to Lorena to begin helping us understand that statutory review process. Thank you.
Hey everyone. So formally, under the Children's Act 2004, it was the responsibility of the local children's safeguarding board to review cases where a child in their area has died and abuse or neglect is known or suspected. This was known as a serious case review, where it would identify lessons learned and identify good practice. This process changed in law in 2017 under the Children's and Social Work Act and Working Together 2018. Whereby serious case reviews became child safeguarding practice reviews and rapid reviews. In the new structure, the responsibility lies with the National Child Safeguarding Review Panel and the local safeguarding partners. In Bristol, this is the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership. Following a notification where a child has died and abuse or neglect is known or suspected, the local authority can initiate a multi-agency rapid review to identify immediate changes to practice and to determine if a further local or national review is required. A recommendation will then be made and shared with the national panel. So in Bristol, the rapid review process starts following a notification of a serious case or incident submitted to the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership. This can be made by any agency. Then information will be gathered from the involved services who are asked to reflect on their involvement with the child and/or family. A rapid review meeting will be held with all the involved partners to discuss the case. The KBSP will then write a report with recommendations and share it with the national panel within 15 working days. The learning from these reviews are shared with professionals via learning briefs and with the family and child or young person. As defined under Working Together 2018, a serious child safeguarding case is those in which abuse or neglect is known or suspected, and where the child has died or has been seriously harmed. Serious harm includes, but is not limited to, serious and/or long-term impairment of a child's mental health or intellectual, emotional, social, or behavioural development. It also covers impairment of physical health. Here are some of the latest publications from the National Panel relating to systemic learning for safeguarding systems across the UK. Some of the key learning themes identified in the 2021 annual report were critical thinking and professional challenge, whole family approach, identity and lived experience, extrafamilial harm, and domestic abuse. These are the key themes that are repeated in all submissions to the National Panel across the UK. Following the latest National Panel publications, such as the Arthur and Starr report, the KBSP have also been conducting webinars, and these can be located on our website. So overall, since March 2021 to December 2022, there have been 5 rapid reviews initiated in Bristol. 2 of these children were under 1. One was a 10-year-old, one 14, and one 15-year-old. 2 of these children were white British, 2 were British Caribbean, and 1 white British and Caribbean. 2 children were female, and 3 were males. 3 children survived, but sadly 2 died. 3 children lived in North Bristol, 1 in East Bristol, and 1 in South Bristol. Only 1 child was in care at the time, and 2 out of the 5 children were identified with SEND needs. The National Panel agreed with the Keeping Bristol Safe Partnership decision not to initiate a local or national child safeguarding practice review for 4 rapid reviews, but the National Panel concurred with the decision to conduct a full Bristol CSPR for 1 rapid review, which was conducted in December 2022, despite the decision not being unanimous across all agencies. I will now pass you on to my colleague Becky, who's going to talk to you about the themes identified in these rapid reviews, good practice and learning.
Thank you very much. So as Lorena set out, there's a really clear framework to enable us as a multi-agency partnership to really learn from when things go wrong and make change and hopefully look at preventing harm in the longer term. And it's been really helpful for us, I think, to have the National Panel established because it enables us to look across the whole national system and understand themes and trends. Fortunately, as you see, we've only, a relatively small number of children would ever be reviewed through the serious incident process in a local area. So understanding themes and practice in a much wider context is really important for us to kind of progress that learning. As Lorena touched on, we have 1 child safeguarding practice review which is currently underway, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the themes around that at the moment. That's due for completion in towards the end of July of this year. And that's particularly focused on our joint investigation and child protection processes and how we can strengthen our safeguarding responses as multi-agency statutory partners in that space. So that really is kind of drawing on what progress we've been able to make locally in response to some of the vulnerabilities identified in about the national system through the Arthur and Starr review, and are highlighting some similar vulnerabilities locally that we're looking to address. So I'll talk to you about that as we kind of think about the learning. I guess the other things I wanted to highlight is we know that some of the issues identified, and you'll have seen that from the list from the National Panel key themes from the annual report, are perennial challenges in relation to safeguarding children. And these are themes that have been identified through the 3 yearly reviews of serious case reviews, and more recently through the National Panel reports. And so some of the work of the National Panel is to take that more helicopter systematic view, to think about what needs to change in the system to start to really help us address some of those long-standing kind of challenges for children and young people to reduce and prevent harm. The other system that's really important that links in with this process is the child death overview process. So there are separate webinars around the child death process, should you be interested. But you may or may not be aware that nationally every death of a child under 18 for any reason, so both expected and unexpected deaths, are reviewed through a child death review process. And obviously many of those deaths are related to children who have significant health issues or who may have been harmed, not in the context of abuse or neglect. But it is important that we do look at the interface, I guess, between the learning from the child death process and through these serious incident processes, similarly to how we think about some of the themes and trends across the wider system. So we know this is not the only process for us to learn as a partnership, but it's an important process. It's one we take really seriously. I think the other kind of bit to talk about is that we know for practitioners that coming together and thinking about what we could do differently when a child's been seriously harmed or died as a result of abuse and neglect be a really, really difficult process. And I think the aim of our system is to try and create a culture which isn't about blame, it's about learning and tries to understand some of the systemic challenges really that can be barriers to practice. So I'd hope that over the course of today you hear some of those messages as well. I'll be pitching it in terms of thinking, I'd like you to think about what you can do in relation to your practice and what you want to take forward from the learning I'm talking about. But there are also messages for those of you who are system leaders, strategic managers, senior managers, to think about how we commission and design services, what some of the barriers are to best practice, and think about how we move that forward as a system. There will be time for questions, but do put questions in the chat as we go so you don't forget them, and I can always come back to them at the end. So the first kind of theme from our rapid reviews that I wanted to touch on was around missing, children who experience harm through exploitation, missing and sexual abuse. So this was relevant within 2 of our rapid reviews in the last 18 months in the period that we're talking about. And we had, unfortunately, both children survived, but both children experienced serious harm. One as a result of serious injuries related to being stabbed in the context of child criminal exploitation and serious youth violence, and another child who experienced serious sexual abuse in the context of child criminal exploitation. And for both, missing was going missing, being reported missing to the police, or their whereabouts not being known, was a pattern for and a part of their kind of experience really, and how the exploitation they experienced presented in their behaviour and what happened to them. And for one of those children, that included internal trafficking, so being moved around the southwest region as a result of the behaviour of the perpetrators of sexual abuse through sexual exploitation. And there are some really common themes. What we know around sexual exploitation, child criminal exploitation, is it's a bit like a Venn diagram. So some of the experiences of trauma and the need for how we approach risk and manage that risk and look at reducing the harm and approach recovery is shared by children who experience criminal and sexual exploitation, and some of it's very different. And I think, you know, we have, as a partnership, tried to grapple with that through some of our work around contextual safeguarding, some of the work you may be aware of through the Bristol child exploitation project, a lot of the resources you can find from that, which was a year of research we undertook in terms of what does best practice look like for children who are criminally and sexually exploited in recovery services. That's all available online as well. We can put the link in the chat. But what we see for children who are exploited, as I said, is some shared experience, particularly where the exploitation is in the context of organised criminality. So where there is the facilitated serious violence and serious harm, and there's overlap between some of those abuse types, and children are experiencing multiple abuse types. We also know that a history of childhood trauma is often shared by children who are more vulnerable in adolescence to exploitation and being targeted, and that's certainly true for these children. And while their experiences of childhood trauma look different, it was their experiences in the under 10 period which really informed their wider vulnerabilities to both criminal and sexual exploitation. Sorry if I cough, I'm just getting to the end of a cold, so hopefully won't be too croaky. So I guess wanted to start by thinking about that early trauma, because this really provides some opportunities for us as a system to think about how we better support young people. So as I said, both young people had experienced early trauma in the family, which had contributed to behaviours which schools really struggled, primary schools really struggled to support children around. So both children who had different academic needs, had quite different kind of backgrounds and kind of cognitive functioning, developmental needs to each other. They were, quite different children in that sense. But both children had struggled in school, and well, schools had struggled around how to kind of be inclusive and support them. Although that had been more successful for one child than the other, and school had been a real kind of place of safety for one of the children. So I guess what we wanted to think, our primary school colleagues to think about, is how we can support children whose early experiences lead to attachment and developmental delay and trauma related behaviours which kind of present in school settings which are really challenging. And one of the kind of key areas that was recognised as a theme throughout was about the need for better support, earlier support for children therapeutically who'd experienced trauma in childhood. So for one of them, it was in relation to his experiences of domestic abuse and physical abuse as a younger child, and how that really presented in his kind of developmental and attachment-based history. And for the other child, it was about her experiences of child sexual abuse. So if I'm going to start by thinking about domestic abuse, what we knew when we looked and could look back over this young person's history is that the services hadn't been there really to support young people around their needs from having witnessed domestic abuse and having experienced physical abuse, alongside domestic abuse. And while that abuse had stopped, and him and his family had, were obviously have moved forward, were in a place of safety, they were still, mum and the family were still trying to support him to manage the trauma that they'd all experienced in relation to that harm. So some of the work that we have done since that review was partner with NextLink and our public health colleagues, and NextLink have bid for and been successful for more resources in the city to support young people who experience domestic abuse. What we know through the Domestic Abuse Act that came out, I think last year before, is that children are now recognised as victims of domestic abuse in their own right, having witnessed or been around domestic abuse in the family home. So that's a really important resource, and one that we need to be thinking about early for children, and thinking about how do we have therapeutic interventions through CAMS. So any CAMS colleagues on here now or on the call now, or through our specialist services, and then through the school settings that can support children at that developmental stage to process the impact of that early trauma. Unfortunately, for one of the children, there was a really delayed recognition of SEND, and I think there was some confusion about what was related to the trauma and what was related to the special educational needs and disabilities. And mum talked a lot about how she'd really struggled navigating that system, and the improvements, I guess, that she'd seen over more recent years, but where it had been historically. So We know that that's been a journey for our schools and for our SEND team, and Mum really spoke to that. But what that had led to for her child was a real sense of dislocation, an inappropriate use of reduced timetables, and that compounded his sort of sense of not belonging, and a vulnerability to looking for connection within his community and peer group, and a vulnerability really to being targeted for criminality. The child who disclosed sexual abuse, who then experienced sexual exploitation in the community, they fed back to the review that they wished that they hadn't disclosed initially after that, because it had led to them coming into care, and had led to rejection by family members, and that disconnection from family had been really profound for them, and services hadn't been able to manage to support them to navigate that safely or as effectively as they would have wanted to. So the profound impact of the loss of their family, they sort of weighed up against the harm that they'd experienced through the sexual abuse. And we know that's true for lots of children, that they will have different relationships with that experience of disclosing, that it has a really profound impact on some of their relationships and their networks. What had been a strength for that young person is that they had remained cared for and connected within their connected network, and that had been important for them in terms of their identity. But there had been a huge amount of loss that they were trying to process in terms of that disclosure and what it meant to disclose sexual abuse. Our children and families talked to us about service provision, and they felt there were some real barriers around flexibility of some of our therapeutic service provision in Bristol. So both children talked about wanting some kind of therapeutic input, but felt that it wasn't there to meet their needs. So they were seen as not being ready for CAM services that were available, but it's fair to say that their needs and experience of trauma were too significant for universal use services. Not that they shouldn't have those universal services, but they didn't match. There's a mismatch between the services being offered through the range of plans and the needs that we're presenting, and the significant history. So there's obviously some work to do around supporting a recognition in the city of trauma, and thinking about access to CAM services for different groups of young people and the pathways around CAM services. So that's come up through this work, and remains part of the ICB's work around trauma-informed practice within the city, trauma-informed commissioning, that the partnership are working on together. And I'm going to talk to you a bit later around some of the work we've taken forward from this as part of this response to partner with the National Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse. There was a concern about adultification. Mum felt that actually for both children, there was a concern about whether they were seen as the developmental age they were, or whether they were adultified because of their extended experience of harm. So both children, experience of trauma led them to go missing, reach out, make contact with risky people, reenact some of the harm that they had experienced, and that adults would then exploit them within that. So people felt frustrated with trying to manage that behaviour, found it difficult, remembering and holding really the kind of age of the child in mind. So some practitioners did that really well, but others struggled more with it. And I think that some of the spaces that people found helpful in terms of just coming back to who is this child, remembering them as a kind of 360, remembering their youth and helping to kind of connect with the developmental age, understanding the history, and where chronology was really important for multi-agency groups to sit down and really think about actually where do these behaviours come from. So rather than getting frustrated with the behaviour, using our kind of trauma-informed approaches to understand where that behaviour comes from. Social media increased risk for vulnerability for both children. So one, that social media was absolutely the kind of context for conflict, and would really charge conflict in the community. So mum would become very aware, and he'd become very aware of being called out through social media or seeing conflict in different groups, and you know, that increasing vulnerability. And for the young person who's experiencing sexual exploitation, social media was a way in which she was connected with individuals who would exploit her. So what we found was that parents and professionals lacked the experience and tools to navigate that effectively, and that it was, you know, social media is such an integrated part of children's experience now. We can't separate it, and so, but often professionals, you know, parents or carers were telling us about what was happening online, but we didn't have a presence there, and we struggled to know how to build that into assessments. So there were some good practice examples of people talking about that, looking at some of what was happening on social media and responding, but sometimes people were minimizing risk of what was coming through social media, or didn't know quite how to pitch it, and so there's an area there for us to kind of continue to work on, really, and thinking about how we build into safeguarding assessments and multi-agency assessments our understanding of social media, and balancing that as a place, and a kind of a place where harm can happen, and think about that tangibly. And finally, the parents and kinship carer and both children told us that they felt there was insufficient support for them to manage the vicarious trauma of children's abuse. So both had different bits of support, but it was quite short term. And they were saying to us, like, we are living this day in, day out. You know, we're living with the anxiety, the stress, our worries for our children, trying to maintain our kind of openness, curiosity, parenting capacity, compassion, and we're doing that with very little support. And their messages that came out through our child exploitation research project as well from parents, and so something that we're looking at closely within our recommissioning of specialist exploitation project services at the moment, but also has led to this increased funding for parent support groups through safer options, but we're not quite there yet. It's certainly not consistent enough. And really understanding what does that support look like. I think on the other side, I don't know, Lorena, if you could click on a slide for me. One of the things that came up from parents was saying often the parent support is around parenting strategies, which may be helpful, but it's not the only thing. Parents were saying, actually, what I really need is the support to manage the trauma, manage the impact of being alongside a child who's been abused, and behaviours that elicits from them, the emotions that brings up for me. How do I stay kind of open to be able to offer compassionate parenting? And so I think it's about how do we reframe and think about what are the support needs. Sometimes we are falling on a kind of parenting intervention rather than a kind of more therapeutic or trauma-informed space. And I think professionals need some support in articulating those parenting needs in relation to parents being able to support children who are being abused outside the family home. There was some excellent practice. We also saw evidence of agencies offering like consistent time to build relationships with children and parents. So we're thinking about some of our family support work services and early help services, where for one of our children were really alongside that parent, and that was seen as really good practice, and was really kind of welcomed by the mum, with the caveats that I've talked about in terms of the approaches that we take. Maybe we could reframe some of that. We also saw consistent support offered by BASE at the point where BASE became involved. The young person talked really positively about that and how that looked different for her in terms of the intensity of the offer, how frequently she was seen, the kind of trusted relationships that was built. We saw some really good practice from the school in relation to the child who'd experienced sexual abuse. So the school had been the location where the child had initially disclosed the familial sexual abuse, and they managed that really well, and that had come out of a PSHE session and some of the work the school had done around consent. And so that's a real example about how we can create environments where it's safe and okay to name sexual abuse and talk about sexual abuse, and the kind of profound impact of that for children. And then the school had stayed alongside her through her care journey in a way that was very kind of meaningful to her. She felt really sort of known by the school. There was I guess what we see is an inconsistency around some of our risk management. So for one child, we saw amazing risk management for the child in care, really frequent multi-agency risk management meetings, very clear, robust plan, good coordination and network, which consistently tracks action plans. There was a very clear disruption plan in relation to perpetrators of sexual exploitation, with oversights from specialist officers. At the point where we have one kind of some examples where missing episodes, so our response missing was inconsistent for these children, but there were some really good examples where it was done well, and where it was done really well, we saw some what enabled that was some senior oversight of those missing investigations, really recognizing the risk, understanding the history of concerns, and the understanding patterns of behavior for both children. So they're the kind of things we want to look for all children and work towards. And sometimes what we're not seeing so much is what we saw in this case, which is in one of these cases, which is that really good frame around risk management and opportunities for the network to come together and really coordinate their responses. We saw kind of compassionate, warm, trauma-informed approaches. We could see the real impact of kind of relationship-based practice, and children and families talk to us about the improvement they had seen over the last few years. These were young people who've been known services for some time, and they could see development of progress from systems. So that's really positive. And where it worked well for children, there was a really robust trigger plan, which was regularly reviewed through risk management meetings, and missing return conversations were held regularly. The information from that informed the risk management plan and was stepped up and down as needed. We also saw networks which really embraced professional challenge. People had some really difficult conversations. Extrafamilial harm, well, all forms of child abuse and harm are complex. There's never going to be, the right way of doing things every time. It's working with uncertainty, and what some of the managers and practitioners in these networks facilitated was that ability to have difficult conversations courageously, openly, and understand different perspectives. And that really helped have a much more nuanced understanding of risk. And I guess what really stood out to us looking across some of the young people we're talking about here and previous reviews is that's not always the case in Bristol. So that ability in that space where multi-agency comes together to talk about risk, being facilitated by team managers openly, non-defensively, across services, felt really important. And what helped was the kind of specificity around being specific around what the harm was we were seeing, where we thought that harm came from, and what our capacity was, our kind of to balance young people's rights to independence with their need for protection. And that's a challenging space for adolescents. And that was talked about. Where it's done well, it was talked about explicitly and clearly, to talk about what can we tolerate and how do we move this forward. Okay, next slide, please. So where were the areas where we needed to improve? There were some missed opportunities to engage individual children with their own interests and kind of develop a pro-social peer network. These kids, there were lots of things they loved, they were interested in, and sometimes the resources was overly focused on kind of behaviour and risk and trauma, and actually the reviews felt there may be opportunities for participation, empowerment, engagement opportunities would have actually created safety in its own right. And some of the research that we know around exploitation is that taking participatory approaches, supporting young people to have aspirations, ambition, opportunities, supports and facilitates recovery in the first instance, but also can create safety with helping young people to move away from or exit risky situations where we haven't been able to disrupt the perpetrators. I've talked about the child where there was insufficient multi-agency meetings. One of the things that was difficult for that child moved between lots of different teams at different times, and there wasn't a kind of consistent approach that really recognised how it sort of entrenched some of these difficulties were, and particularly around education. So I think we tended to, as professionals, look at a kind of acute incidents, and it's stepped up and down. This not just in social care, but in a number of different areas between teams. And so we sort of skimmed the surface, and we needed to step back and really understand the history. There has been a kind of consistent lead for the oversight for what our young people seem to fall between multiple policing teams. So because there are types of harm for both these young people presented in different spaces, they might be presenting around antisocial behaviour, around missing, there's the disclosure of familial sexual abuse, then there were disclosures around CSE, potential child criminal exploitation, and then serious youth violence, peer conflict. There were different police teams responding to all of it. And then you had the school policing officers and neighbourhoods, and there was no kind of single point of contact. And that meant that some of the risk management wasn't as robust as it needed to be. Police didn't have a unified picture of these children. And that's in a kind of area for improvement, really, particularly for children experiencing extrafamilial harm, that there is a much more kind of coordinated offer. That's something that's being looked at across the VRU policing and CID and Operation Topaz. Sometimes there was this over-optimism and over-emphasis on what parents could achieve rather than interventions for the child. So we didn't seem to quite get the balance right between what influence changes to parenting approaches would be able to have an extrafamilial harm context. And that's not to say that it wasn't necessary, it was just over relied on, rather than thinking about actually what needs to happen with the child or the wider context, or the whole picture. We saw this as a primarily parenting issue in some circumstances, whereas we know from all the research that actually, while parenting interventions can be really effective, like nonviolent resistance, some of our adolescent PPAP courses, things like that, can be really support parenting capacity and children outcomes in the community. They are not a panacea, and actually many parents would struggle to influence and shift children who are being abused, particularly through organised abuse in the community. There was unmet needs with education and counterprovision, which increased vulnerability for the children. There were some opportunities to strengthen information sharing between education settings, particularly between mainstream schools and ALP. And I think that we still have a way to go as a system to really understand make sure we have the educational literacy of what children's educational rights are. We found that there had become a bit of a culture in Bristol of accepting or normalising children receiving educational packages that are not legal, are insufficient. And so we need to kind of continue to build people's confidence in knowing what children's rights are around their educational offer, and then being able to navigate the system to challenge and escalate that. There was lack of disruption around those causing harm regarding child criminal exploitation, serious youth violence. We're struggling really sometimes to understand the context of young people who are drug running, where the drug supply is coming from, who is benefiting from that at a more kind of senior or adult level, and disrupting that. And then the knock-on of disrupting that, we have fewer tools around that, although it is developing, it is more challenging. Touched on social media. There was issues around the grading of risk initially in some of our missing periods by police. It took too long to recognise children as being high risk. And there's some work happening with the police around reviewing that and the consistency around that. There's some opportunities that came out through the review about whether we could be more creative in our use of deprivation of liberty orders within community settings. So in parents' homes and within foster care placements, to prevent the escalation to residential care. Because one child did end up in a residential placement for their safety with deprivation of liberty restrictions in place, I guess we were questioning as a partnership, would it have made difference if we'd been able to put some of those restrictions in place within a foster care setting? And it may or may not, because actually they'd still be living in a community. It could have increased conflict, but there are just some opportunities there that we could explore at an earlier stage, and for young people to minimise their disruption and the loss really of moving out of area. We talked about the need for making sure that children's emotional and psychological needs are met following abuse and trauma in childhood, and building kind of the therapeutic offer available through schools and through specialist services. So that's touched on here. And there were some opportunities, although a lot of our support for foster carers was good, there were some opportunities to kind of bring that in earlier and think about it earlier, because it took too long for some of the specialist support through Thinking Aloud and through our therapeutic services to kick in, and we could have preempted actually that this child had experiences which would lead to behaviours that the foster carer would find difficult to manage. So we need to be preempting that rather than waiting for things to be wobbly and difficult. I think one of the things that I would touch on around that is around traumatic sexualization, and this links in, I guess, to the CAMS provision and the CAMS pathway. So for a young person who'd experienced sexual exploitation and a history of child sexual abuse, the challenge with our sexual abuse pathway is she kept falling between different places. So what we know is that children who experience sexual abuse, some children will experience traumatic sexualization, and that will lead them to experience and present in a way that where their sexual development may be seen as problematic or harmful, but it is a known and well-researched should be an expected part of a young person's experience of sexual abuse and development. That is a common experience for children who've experienced sexual abuse, but the services struggled to know how to manage that, whether they should receive support through Be Safe, whether they should receive support through BASE, whether they should get a sexual abuse service. And so they just kept bouncing between these different pathways. And so they ended up receiving a service in BASE that was good and was well received. And there was some consultation from other services earlier on, but it took too long to get there. And actually, we were then very much focused on trying to manage the sexual abuse that was happening around sexual exploitation, whereas that core need around the childhood sexual abuse that happened in the family, sort of, which really was driving everything, remained slightly kind of unexplored and unsupported. And you know, I think that's the risk, that the harm in childhood is presenting in the present, and we're only able to deal with and work with what's in the present without really grappling with what's driving that and what's presenting from the past in the present. And so that's something for us all to think about in our assessments and how we plan our interventions. And there were some opportunities. Some of what happened to these children was quite publicly reported. That really impacted the peer networks in schools and education settings. And children were involved in giving evidence as part of like missing investigations, and schools really noted that there was an absence of support for that wider peer group or them as a school. And in response to that, the Vanguard have funded Bernardo's, in partnership with Safer Options, for mental health practitioners who can come alongside peer groups where friends are experiencing harm. It doesn't have to be this serious in relation to community risk, and that service is up and running. So if you're in an education setting or you're interested in how that might develop, we do have 2 mental health practitioners now based within BASE who can support wider peer groups and schools and organisations when we know they're being impacted by the harm that their peers are experiencing. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to move us on to think about our 2 babies who experienced harm, non-accidental injury. I think it's worth noting that Bristol's themes and trends and demographic very closely match the national picture, which is that teenagers and under ones are our most vulnerable group to serious harm or death related to abuse or neglect. So we absolutely follow the similar trends. we were thinking about these children and thinking about kind of what worked well and our lessons to learn. So first of all, in terms of what worked well, these children were not, one was not known to statutory services and was only known by universal services, and one was open as a child in need at the time of their death. So slightly different kind of legal statuses and framework around them. We did see some really good practice, particularly in relation to kind of good multidisciplinary discussion by health regarding an early injury to a sibling. So for one of the children, there'd been a pattern of accidental injuries and presenting in hospital with multiple accidental injuries for the sibling and the child themselves. And a lot of those were very normal childhood events that happen to children all the time. There was a bit of a pattern of them. And one of those occasions, health visiting and the GP had a conversation about the information that had come from the hospital to think about what might be happening in the family, whether there were some issues around supervision levels, whether parents might need some additional support. There was some really good evidence of health services with health visitor being really proactive in trying to engage parents around some of their parenting strategies and additional support, and the health visitor accessed specialist advice when they needed and when was appropriate for the children. So we could see some real system enablers of good practice. These children had siblings. One was part of a very large sibling group, and we saw some examples of good practice with some of the siblings who were very different ages in one of the cases. So young carer support was offered for siblings, and we saw an example of some really good practice from a school nurse in relation to exploring risk for one of the older sibling in relation to their sex and relationships, and potential increased vulnerability to child sexual exploitation, use of child sexual exploitation tools to explore that with them. That was really good practice, separate from non-accidental injury, but was noted by the review. We saw also good examples from primary schools in particular around inclusive needs, inclusive approaches to support some siblings in some of these groups. So things like use of Thrive groups, access to counselling, some support plans which were specific to the children and recognising what was happening at home. So there are some good examples there of how education settings can really wrap around families. And that there was examples of universal services exploring risk around domestic abuse appropriately in that maternity kind of pathway. There's some examples actually across both these children around parenting choices. So in relation to sleeping positions and feeding approaches and things like that. And obviously some of that is parental choice. Well, that is parental choice. But there is examples of health colleagues really sensitively engaging with people around their parents, around their reasons, and making sure they were informed about the decisions they were making. So that was, really sort of positive to see. In terms of kind of lessons to learn, there were, we could see some pressures from COVID, even though this is kind of more recently, and resources. We can see that the demand in the system is making it harder for us to respond. So this is about, there's a pathway for if parents present with young children in hospital, how information is then triaged and shared with health visitors, midwives, and GPs. And that system's a bit overwhelmed at the moment through the demand and the resourcing of those teams and what's happening across the health system. So we could see that there potentially were opportunities for earlier engagement with mum and parents, mum and dad, in relation to one of these children. And in a perfectly resourced system, we perhaps would have gone out to do some injury prevention work. But but we recognise the pressures. So that whole pathway is under review with public health leading with our health colleagues, the RCB, to look at how we can have a safe system that you know, prioritises what information is needed, and we can put preventative interventions in place. Sorry, excuse me. There are some opportunities potentially for a bit more professional curiosity about a succession of injuries to the child. Sorry, and their sibling. Like I say, they were normal injuries for a child of that age, but there were a few more than we'd expect, and so we've been thinking about, well, what are the things that help trigger that curiosity, you know, and that is about that system. How do we alert when there have been multiple attendances or they're unusual? And that led to some of those missed opportunities. So you can see some of the areas for improvement there, which is linking all the way through to how we understand presentation at our hospital. Next slide, please. One of these reviews, though, did lead to us commissioning a child safeguarding practice review. And this is all in relation to improving our child protection response. So the review found that there were opportunities for us to improve our assessment of children, and particularly children in large families, as part of the child in need process. And there is what we are concerned about for this child is that in a large family, the baby, the youngest child, got a bit lost in that assessment process, and we didn't really analyse the risk as effectively as we might have at those different developmental ages. So we had children who aged from like very young baby through to well, young adults actually in this family, so they crossed the whole developmental age. And so when the risks were being assessed, they presented very different harm to different groups, and some of those harms were mitigated or accentuated depending on the roles and interactions with the other siblings. It was a really complex piece of work, despite the actual, perhaps the presenting issues not being as complex within other families, but because of the size of the family. So there's a real opportunity for us to perhaps strengthen how we approach our child in need kind of process and assessment. But we saw that continue into the child protection response following the child's death and baby's death. And so unusually, we've triggered a CSPR based on how our learning for the response to the child death in relation to how we were able to safeguard the wider sibling group, whether we could have safeguarded the wider sibling group more effectively in the period following the child's death. So that's quite unusual, but what it highlighted to us through the review is that there were vulnerabilities in our child protection system that we could strengthen, and so CSPR gives us the opportunity to do that. And we could see some themes and trends perhaps across the national reviews and some of our local practice audits and things like that. So these are some key areas we'd like you to think about if you're involved in child protection responses. So strategy meetings, section 47, your paediatricians involved in medicals, if you're social workers and police officers doing joint investigations. So there's some opportunity for improving the kind of joint investigation plans. We think they could be more analytical and systematic. So we had a lot of people involved, the number of people who could have caused harm to the baby. We were working with uncertainty. This was an unexpected child death. So the cause of death was unknown. But we couldn't exclude non-accidental injury, and there were lots of people who could have caused that non-accidental injury. And what we would like to have seen more of is a very clear kind of planning around what are our different hypotheses and how are we going to find the evidence to exclude or exclude them or not exclude them, so that we can work in a more analytical way with the risk that we're presented with, which is an uncertainty really around the harm that's being caused, whether this is natural causes or whether it's non-accidental. We saw some challenges in balancing the different priorities, and that really fed into some of the kind of inconsistent language and interpretation of the language. So we had the process around an unexpected child death and the police investigation around an unexpected child death. There was then also the coroner's pathway in terms of determining which pathway for coroners and post-mortem we needed to follow. Then there was the safeguarding of the wider sibling group. And sometimes the language and the evidence and the views around those three different parts of our safeguarding system and response to child death system got mixed up, and people thought they were talking about the same thing and they were talking about different things with different purposes. And so that importance of kind of recognizing what are our different priorities here, what are we trying to achieve, and who's leading on which bit, and what information do we need for what, actually just needed some slower thinking. So for example, there was a direction from the pathologist to treat the case as shaken baby. Police interpreted that as that meant that they would follow the coroner's pathway in relation to potential non-accidental injury, but it didn't necessarily mean there was sufficient evidence to follow that kind of pathway around their investigative process. Would have a slightly different threshold or thinking in terms of who may have caused harm, so they were staying in an unexpected death space. And then the wider question about, well, what does that mean in relation to the wider siblings and risk to wider siblings? Are we saying that this is a non-accidental injury or not? So it's how do we work well with uncertainty, because we know a lot of child protection is about working with uncertainty. We have to balance risk and harm, and possible harm. You know, there's huge harm to children if we look at removing them or putting different safety plans in place, when actually death may not be suspicious, but it might be. So how do we balance that? And then it's about the tools for balancing that. Social care identified we should have sought earlier legal advice. So we should have a legal there to give us advice about the best legal framework for safeguarding children. We were quite late in looking at the legal framework for safeguarding the wider siblings. So that's some learning for children's social care. There was some potential learning and risk around racialized or gendered bias about assessing risk. So we had multiple potential causes of harm, and there was a risk that people thought that harm was more likely to be caused by one person in the family, and we felt that some of that was not supported by the evidence and was based around, yes, around prior history, but potentially around their gender and race as well. So needing to be kind of curious and challenge each other around that and be evidential. There was real impact. There was an impact in our child protection process of workforce efficiency challenges, vacancy rates within social care teams, paediatricians, trained police officers. So look, you know, as a system, we need to look at how we mitigate and manage that risk and ensure that how we kind of move forward with our, you know, improving workforce efficiency across the partnership, really, because it was the combined risk of pressures in all services and increasing demand. And we also saw opportunities for improvement with handovers between out of hours teams. So both for the Operation Ruby police team, the response, because it happened out of hours, was initially led by CID and then handed over. And for social care, it happened with EDT and then was handed over. And that created kind of inconsistency about what is our kind of analysis of risk, what's the plan. And we need to do some work about how we come back together after a serious incident and improve the handovers between EDT, or the out of hours teams and our in hours teams, so that there's a consistent analysis of risk and we understand what we're working with and what hypothesis we're working with. So that's the focus of our child safeguarding practice review at the moment. Okay, I'm going to just take a breath so people can digest that. Have some water. The final rapid review I'm going to just talk you through is in relation to medical neglect in a disabled child. So when I say medical neglect, I mean neglect of a child's health needs rather than organisational neglect. I haven't phrased that very well, so just to be clear, I don't mean organisational neglect by health. I mean parental neglect of health needs in terms of following health advice and provision of medical care. So this is a disabled child with very complex, unique needs. He was a 10-year-old young person, 10-year-old child, who had very significant health and complex health needs. The concerns that were considered during this review was around whether or not the inconsistent provision of his, the inconsistent meeting of his care needs related to his health may have contributed to his death. This child had life-limiting illnesses, so but the timing of his death was unexpected, and we haven't been able to include either way that it was. So this has been an opportunity for us to come together and think about how we work with this harm within the context of children with disabilities. So there was some amazing practice in this case. The social worker was fantastic. All agencies thought the social worker was absolutely brilliant. Did such a complex network of professionals, and they led really good multi-agency information sharing, regular meetings. There was very clear communication, regular kind of contact across the very complex network, kind of dynamic assessment of this child's needs, which fluctuated and changed. So that was really, really positive. They also really facilitated and supported good quality transitions between school, home care and short breaks. So we had various home care providers involved, mainly due to breakdowns in relationships with parents, and managing, obviously that is a really significant risk to a child with complex needs in relation to who's caring for them and the need for their vulnerability around the provision of some of that healthcare. So that was really carefully managed, and really positive. There's also just absolutely compassion and care and love for this child from their school and from short breaks, and he was really known, he was really cared about. They long-standing relationships, people went above and beyond, stepped into looking after and supporting the family and him. That was a privilege to see. And professionals really enabled him to have a rich and fulfilling family and personal life, a wide network of activities and experiences, despite the significant, his significant disabilities and health needs. And there is evidence again, and we've seen this before, of culture of professional challenge and constructive discussions about what was in this child's best interests in a non-defensive way. That was really positive to see. And family networks were promoted, so wider family, aunts, uncles were engaged with and thought about. Okay, next slide, please. So there were some areas that we felt needed to improve. So there was such a lot of involvement for this young person, and there was almost daily reporting between agencies over many years. He'd had a package of support since he was born, pretty much, because of his needs. So seeing the wood for the trees was difficult in terms of understanding the pattern, and because it was slightly incident by incident, trying to manage and hold the package together. So we just felt that there would be it'd be helpful to think about neglect in relation to health needs for disabled children. Use of tools such as chronologies, graded care profile 2 might make that more tangible, might make it more real for children and young people. So that's really important to enable, because it was about, for this child, what was going to be the trigger to step that up and recognise these issues as child protection concern. We had gone into court, we were in court proceedings at the time of the child's death, and there were differences of opinion within court around whether the child was experiencing significant harm or not as a result of the healthcare they were receiving. So it was really challenging, and using tools such as chronologies and graded care profile would help potentially kind of map those experiences. There's also sometimes a lack of challenge to the child's mother by some professionals, and mainly they were professionals who didn't work with disabled children, and it was felt by the review that there was potentially a disableism, really, and around lots of people seeing how that this was very difficult to parent a child with this level of complex needs, they had lower expectations of what should be expected of parents in this situation, whereas our colleagues with expertise around disability brought a different challenge around, maintaining the rights of the child and an understanding of what was normal and expected from parents of disabled children, and holding our expectations for what's good enough for disabled children. So we could see some real champions of that, but it wasn't consistent. And we know that some people step back from having more challenging conversations with parents and we think that this may potentially be part of that. There was assessments we think could be developed a bit more, so assessments across lots of different agencies to balance between carer stress and neglect, and that was quite difficult at times, like how much of this is about the carer being stressed, how much of this is about actual neglect, and does it matter at what point does carer stress translate into neglect for this child? So there are things to think about in your practice about what, remaining curious, remaining open to the idea of, am I holding in mind what's good enough for this child? How much is their disability coming into that? How much am I minimizing or changing my expectation and need based on their disability? And thinking about that. This was a complex situation, and some practitioners were really stuck in quite conflictual relationships with parents who are obviously at the centre of their child's care and access to their child's care. So we felt that they needed a space to kind of engage as a network and think about, how do we get unstuck with this parent, and how do we understand what might have led them to adapting in this way, to communicate in this way, where might that have come from for them, how might we change our approach? People tried lots of things, tried different things, but we felt that a reflective space would be helpful, and use of potentially resources from across the system to have someone independent facilitating that conversation, and that being the focus rather than just on planning, knowing that working to build more open and honest relationships with the parent would have helped that wider assessment. We identified some workforce development needs in relation to the understanding of trauma, particularly racial trauma for parents, and looking at the intersection between race and disability. So there is less work out there in relation to, what is a culturally informed approach to supporting families who are Black, who have children with disabilities. Obviously that's going to look really different for different families, but it was really important for this family to think about the ethnicity and cultural competency of people coming into their home, who was caring for the child, and their relationship with organisations and institutions, and how they were assessing their parenting needs. And so we just, obviously it's an area for continuing to development. And it was noted that domestic abuse by mother to father was not shared by the police to partners, which perhaps impacted on our assessment of what was happening. And what we felt was that what the police didn't recognise, and this was a theme in a number of different areas, was the increased vulnerability of this child due to their complex needs. They really were as vulnerable as a newborn baby in relation to potential physical harm, and in some aspects even more so than that. And we didn't feel that the kind of context in relation to their vulnerability and needs was really understood, as well as might be in making that decision about what should be shared and how the risk could be understood, because that risk would have looked different for a 10-year-old who didn't have those needs. So, we needed to be open to that. Next slide, please. So there are rapid reviews. I hope that's been helpful. I know there's some questions in the chat that we'll come back to. I've touched on some of the kind of lessons learned and what we're doing in Bristol, and you can see some more here. I'm not going to go through them all in lots of detail. There are lots of resources that have come up and through as a result of these rapid reviews. So I've talked about how these have informed commissioning, bidding for and getting the money for more domestic abuse services for children. That's supported the mental health workers and practitioners in base to work with peer groups. We've enabled and supported the new clinical psychologists working with children through who are experiencing sexual exploitation and criminal exploitation, who's based within the Be Safe team and can support trauma-informed practice for professionals around understanding previous trauma histories and think about interventions. There's been a whole range of workforce development opportunities. I'm going to highlight the child sexual abuse pathway resources, which we launched yesterday at an event around improving our response to child sexual abuse in the city. So these rapid reviews do trigger change, they change our resources and system. Obviously there's real learning for you as well as practitioners. So I'm going to pause because I've given you a huge amount of information. I'm going to give you 30 seconds. I'd just like you to take a moment, think about what stands out for you, what your reflections are about what you'd like to see different in your practice, what your takeaways are. Just going to give you silence. I've talked at you for quite a long time. And then I'm going to come back and open it up for questions, comments or reflections. Thank you. I think we can take the slides down, can't we?
Just to let everyone know, I'm going to stop the recording now just while people are having the opportunity to reflect, and then we'll open it up to that question and answer that Becky just touched on.